Yeah, this is a great presentation. If anybody attended our trademark and branding presentation last year, you surely had a great time. And if you didn't, please look it up on YouTube and watch it. It is like the best crash course in all the do's and don'ts of infringing other people's intellectual property, how to do it, how not to do it. My trademark colleague just kind of looking so uncomfortable as Ben Reeder from Backcountry is telling her about how, like, yeah, it's okay, man. Wu-Tang's not going to find out that we made a beer with their name in it. It was great. So yeah, and Leif was, of course, on the panel. So for those of you who don't know Leif, he is a managing partner at Hired Guns Creative, a small but mighty design agency focused on providing branding and packaging design to craft breweries. Everybody knows his work. If they've seen Driftwood, if they've seen Backcountry, it's really gorgeous stuff. He handles new business development for his agency and oversees business operations. You talk to Leif and you get a very clear sense of his depth of knowledge of our industry. He is the first person I usually recommend when someone comes to me and says, listen, I'm looking at doing some branding, because he sees the whole picture. So he's awesome. Hired Guns has provided award-winning design to the alcohol sector since 2008 for clients ranging in size from startup nanos all the way up to big national brands. So please welcome Leif to the stage. Who very kindly exited the stage to allow me to get on the stage, and pass it back to you, sir.
Thanks, man. That was fun. Sure. Hi, everybody. So, like Carlos said, my name is Leif Miltenberger. I'm one of the owners of Hired Guns Creative. Our studio specializes in branding and packaging design for craft alcohol producers, just like he said. We're located in Nanaimo, but our clients are spread across North America. Our client split is roughly 65% beer, 20% spirits, 10% wine, and 5% other stuff. And that other stuff would be cider, hard seltzer, non-alcoholic beverages, and weed. We've been lucky enough to design branding for a lot of companies who make alcohol over the years. And we've designed lots of packaging for those same companies, as well as for a lot of other producers that already had their branding in place when they came to us. So what do we actually do? A lot of different things related to our clients' visual identities and overall brands, but primarily we're known for two things: branding and packaging design. At the root of everything, this is why our company exists. We get people to try your new beer for the first time. You got to get them to try it the second time. So now that you know a little bit about us and what we do, let's talk about rebranding. By the way, I'm going to post a link to these slides at the end of the talk for anybody who wants them. So rebranding a brewery is no small thing. Rebranding projects typically have significant scopes, timelines, and associated costs. They can be driven by a variety of reasons that I'll get into here shortly. As a design firm that's focused on the beer industry, we've seen and participated in a number of brewery rebrands over the years, some more successful than others. In order to talk about brewery rebrands, I always start by defining what rebrand means. What do people mean when they say that a brewery has rebranded? Some parts of this are easy, but others get a little murky. So when your brewery changes names, that's definitely a rebrand. New logo, rebrand. New packaging with the same logo. So here's where it starts to get a little murky. It really depends on how far your new packaging has moved away from the old packaging. If you redesign your packaging to the point where everything except your logo looks completely different, people are going to say that you've rebranded yourself. And new logo but keeping the same packaging, I mean, I guess that counts, but it's really rare to see this. So then what's the difference between a rebrand or a brand refresh? A rebrand typically involves tearing down your brand and carefully rebuilding it. A brand refresh is more moderate. It usually consists of subtle tweaks to the brand to bring it in line with changes in the market. The difference comes down to fundamentally changing your brand versus just updating it. It's worth noting here as well that these two terms, rebrand and refresh, get used interchangeably by people who don't spend as much time thinking about this stuff as I do, which is fine. You know, we've done brand refresh projects, and then they launched, and the beer press and the bloggers called them rebrand projects, which it's fine. It doesn't bother me. Okay, so now that the definitions are out of the way, how do you recognize when it's time to rebrand your brewery? Rebrands are usually meant to solve problems that are a lot bigger than just an outdated logo. So here are some problems and challenges that rebranding can help with. New product development. So this could be new products within your existing tiers, or you might be launching an entirely new tier. Or maybe your brewery's business model involves launching new products all the time. Unless you're locked into a really rigid packaging design system, the new packaging for each new beer is going to require some consideration. Also, new product launches can be used to stagger the launch of a company-wide rebrand if you can't afford to launch new packaging across all your products simultaneously. Next up, expansion. Moving into distribution for the first time, or starting to distribute into new regions, maybe even new countries. New markets can have unfamiliar demographics, or they can have unfamiliar visual vernaculars. Messaging and visuals that resonate in your home market might not work in other regions. And as an alternative to trying to expand your existing brand into new regions, you might even want to consider creating a sub-brand to go after different demographics. You know, Voodoo Ranger, great example of this approach. That brand was created specifically to target the esports and video game demographic, and it's doing really well for them. Number 3, ownership change or corporate merger. I find that new owners of breweries almost always want to put their stamp on their acquisition by rebranding. So here's a big one. You know it might be time to evolve when your brand has become outdated, stale, or fragmented. Constantly releasing new products is fun and can help build buzz about your brand, but it can lead to brand fragmentation if you're not careful. Also, times change, and your brand needs to change with them. It's possible that what you once thought was a good idea for a label could now be considered offensive. Here's a recent before and after of an Ontario beer called Naughty Neighbor. I mean, it's better. The beer name doesn't make much sense anymore now that they swapped out the pinup art for the roller derby. I feel like they just should have started from scratch. And there's an important side note here to think about. New branding and packaging can reflect contemporary sensibilities and help you attract new customers, but it can also help you attract new team members as well, as you can probably imagine from this example. If you're spending a lot of time and money on marketing but still not seeing enough return when it comes to your sales, it could be because of how people perceive your brewery. You know, rebranding can help with this. Perhaps consumer demographics in your market have shifted. New customers have arrived and they are looking for something fresh instead of something established. Or maybe you're facing increased market saturation, which everybody is right now. You know, as we know, the retail situation is more crowded than it's ever been these days. And every product on those shelves is yelling as loud as it possibly can to try and get noticed. Maybe your products are no longer standing out from your competition. Repositioning. Maybe you launched your brewery with a specific focus on a specific style of beer, but then your focus shifted after you realized that not many people are going to be interested in a brewery that only makes brut IPAs. Or maybe you decided that you're going to narrow your focus and only make barrel-aged beers from here on out. I mean, those are extreme examples, but repositioning can be useful to help clarify and restate what your brewery is all about. And it can also help overcome reputation issues if that's a challenge you're facing. Perhaps you'd like to raise your prices. You know your products are worth more than what you're currently charging, but you find it difficult to charge what you're worth. Rebranding can change the way your customers perceive your brand and allow you to raise your prices accordingly. And last up is everybody's favorite, well, it's Carlos's favorite, intellectual property conflicts. If you didn't do your due diligence when choosing your brewery's name, you might run into an issue where trademark conflict forces you to rebrand. Thankfully, that's pretty rare, but it does happen from time to time. If you're considering rebranding your brewery, but you do not have any of these issues, personally, I think you should spend your time and money elsewhere. If you go into a rebranding project where you don't have any of these problems, I can tell you from direct experience that the project's not going to go very well. It's not going to have any urgency. It's going to drag on longer than it should. The end results are going to be underwhelming. You might not even make it through the project. That's happened. In terms of our direct experience with rebranding, we've rebranded 11 clients over the years, and their reasons for rebranding came straight out of that previous list that I showed you. I'm not expecting you to read all of this chart. It's the reasons section that I want to highlight here. You got expansion, ownership changes, brand fragmentation, performance, just all straight off that previous list. It's important to mention that not every problem or a challenge that a brewery might face can be solved by rebranding. You really need to be aware of the problems you're trying to solve before you start in on a rebrand project. It's the only way you're going to be able to measure how effective the rebrand was. You know, it seems weird to me that I have to say this out loud, but rebranding's not going to make your beer any better. Boredom is another reason that can drive breweries to rebrand. It seems like after about 3 years, the internal marketing team, the outside marketing agency, the brewery's advisors, people get bored and they start to tinker. The problem is, about 2 or 3 years in is precisely when a new brand has really started to steep into the public consciousness. I would argue that that's exactly when a brewery should become more consistent and not less. And one final reason that is not a good reason to rebrand your brewery is if your designer decides to quit designing and move to a Gulf island to raise alpacas. In this situation, you should look for a designer who's good enough that he or she can step into your existing brand and pick up where the previous designer left off without your customers noticing. I really don't think you should let an external circumstance that's out of your control like this dictate a crucial business decision like rebranding a brewery. Okay, so I've talked about the reasons breweries often have for rebranding, both good and bad. The second aspect of recognizing when it's time to rebrand has to do with timing. For this, I think it's useful to look at the history of brewery rebrands in the BC market. Craft beer industry here started off in 1984. It grew slowly for a while, but began to accelerate in 2013 when regulations changed to allow breweries to operate their own tasting rooms. I did a survey earlier this month and counted 225 breweries in the province right now. That includes brew pubs and contract brewing brands. So as far as I can tell from my research, only 32 of those breweries in BC have ever rebranded themselves. That's according to my definition of rebranding from a few slides ago. So new name, new logo, or significantly different packaging. This graphic shows the timelines of those 32 breweries. The 3 that started back in 1984, those are on the bottom left, and other breweries were added as the years went by. Green triangles indicate the year each brewery was founded, and every circle is a rebrand. Yellow stars indicate ownership changes, and blue squares are brewery name changes. I included ownership changes and name changes because they were easy to find when I was researching this topic. The other reasons behind the various brewery rebrands are less easy to discover from the outside looking in. Now, if we overlay the timelines of those breweries that have rebranded on top of the growth of the market, we can compare the timing of those rebrands to the overall growth of the market. So I know this chart is a little bit of a cluster, but I made it because I was looking for a way to visualize this information. I couldn't find it. I wanted to better understand how rebrands factor into the market, and I think there's some interesting stuff in here. As you'd expect, the number and frequency of rebrands starts to increase as the market becomes more saturated. And we also start to see more rebrands happening each year. In 2017, there were 12 breweries in the province that rebranded. 2019 has only seen 3 so far, but the year's not out yet. Looking at this, you might be thinking about the size of the breweries. How big were they when they rebranded? It's a really good question, and unfortunately, I don't have the answer yet. I'm still researching this, and I'm not ready to talk about it. Honestly, the data is tough to track down. Not a lot of people want to share that stuff. So hopefully I'll get there at some point. Yeah. So I've shown this chart to a couple brewery owners, and their immediate follow-up question is always, okay, so what's the average number of years between rebrands? So the tricky part about that question is, where do you start measuring from? If you start with the launch of the 3 original craft breweries back in 1984, the average number of years between rebrands is a lot different than if you start measuring more recently. And brewery owners want to know this number because of how it affects them in the current market, not just out of historical curiosity about the old days. So my data that I've got on here from 1984 to probably around 2004 it's a bit spotty. There was no social media to document everything that was happening back then, and I know it's spotty. So I decided to cut that time period out for the purposes of answering the question of how often breweries rebrand. Drew a line in the sand starting at the beginning of 2005. Totally arbitrary, but the market has changed so much that it's also kind of necessary for the next bit of info to have any relevance in the current market. On average, BC breweries rebrand every 4.9 years. Again, this is since 2005. So this could be useful information for your long-term planning. It could also be useful when evaluating your competitors, trying to estimate when they might rebrand. Okay, part 2. You guys still with me? Cool. How far should you try to push a brand evolution? Well, it depends on whether you've decided to go for a rebrand or a refresh. Back to this Venn diagram from earlier, a refresh should not push so far that your customers no longer recognize your products. The before and after shots of your beers should seem logical. That there should be continuity. That's what a refresh is. Big Beer is good at this. Coors is a great example of a brand evolution made up of periodic refreshes. The design from 1978 really doesn't look much like the 2015 version, but you can see the brand DNA carrying through their entire evolution. They pushed it a fair bit, but over 35 years. If they had tried to go straight from that 1978 can to the 2015 one, I think they might have lost some people. So back to the question, how far can you push a rebrand? Unfortunately, there's no quantifiable way to answer this question. You can push it 42% before you lose your customers. It doesn't work like that, right? The only way I've found to answer this question is by looking at other brewery rebrands and attempting to gauge how successful they were. So let's look at some craft examples. Here's the change that Ballast Point made a couple of years before they were acquired. You can see the evolution of their branding and their packaging here. The logo's cleaner and more legible, and same with their packaging. By the way, if you're working on a rebrand and your designer is pitching you logo concepts that are less legible than your current logo, going the wrong way. The changes Ballast Point made here are drastic enough that I would definitely classify this as a rebrand rather than just a refresh. And it's hard to argue with the success of this one, right? Given that Constellation paid $1 billion, American dollars, for this brand. Next up, I'm going to run through a couple rebranding projects we've done for breweries in this market. And both of them had us push their brands pretty far. So first up's Driftwood. They started in 2008. We rebranded them in 2014 as part of their effort to expand into new regions. This is their original logo, which they did not let us change. By the time we started working with them in 2014, their brand had become fragmented. They had opted for the fully custom approach to their packaging design, where every label is almost completely different from every other beer label. And that's a tough approach to keep from getting fragmented. The only consistency across their lineup at that point was their logo, the square shape of their labels, and the fact that they had stuck exclusively to bombers. For the rebrand, Driftwood didn't want to change their logo or the names of their existing beers. And they wanted to keep some of the subject matter of some of those labels, but everything else was up for grabs. They elected to stay with that fully custom approach to packaging design, although we took it one step further for them by creating custom die-cut shapes for each of their labels. Here are some of those die-cut shapes. One on the bottom left, Sartori, that was the first one we ever did for them. And you can see the die cut isn't very crazy on that one. We were testing the waters there, seeing what would work aesthetically, and as well as making sure that the labels would apply smoothly on their bottling line. The glue that holds their current brand together, in my opinion, is intense illustration, slick custom typography, and those unique die-cut shapes. It's kind of ironic, but creating custom dies for each label actually ended up helping tie their brand together, rather than causing it to fragment. These are their Bird of Prey series, so barrel-aged sours, and each release in this one gives us a chance to draw a new badass bird, which is fun. My favorite is that one, just because it stares at you from across a liquor store. So in late 2017, 3 years after we started working on their rebrand, Driftwood made the decision to add a canning line. As this was their largest expansion yet, they needed to make sure that the packaging for those cans was as effective as their bombers. They opted to package their core beers in secondary boxes, so 4-packs for the tall boys and 6-packs for the 3 55 ml cans. We extended the bomber label designs to take advantage of the larger canvas that those boxes gave us. And so how did the rebrand work for them? Well, it's hard to measure exactly how much of their success has come directly from what we did, because there's so many factors that influenced their growth around that time. They were hiring new salespeople, expanding production capabilities, different distribution relationships. There was a lot of moving pieces there. But there's no question that the rebrand played a large role in all of that, especially helping them crack open some new markets. This rebrand pushed the Driftwood brand quite a bit. But did it push it too far? I don't think so. Here's another example, my second one. Bowen Island, founded in '94, rebranded in 2005 when it changed ownership, rebranded again in 2014, and then by us in 2017. So when Northam brought us on to start this rebrand, they had decided to keep some of the Bowen product names and the overall focus of the brand, which is the coastal region of BC, right? They gave us free rein to change everything else, including the logo. So 2017, that's the one we did. We ended up using what we call a hybrid approach for these packaging design. This is where there's a cohesive look and feel across a range of products that's created by consistent placement of various branding and design elements. But then there's also unique illustration, unique color schemes to help get the personality of each product across a little bit. These are their mix packs, which they like to redesign every year. And so how did the rebrand do for Bowen? Well, there were considerably fewer moving parts here than there was on the Driftwood project. All Bowen really changed was their branding and their packaging. That made it much easier for them to gauge how effective the rebrand was. So the stuff we did for them in 2017 pushed the brand quite a ways beyond what the look that they had in 2014. But did it go too far? The rebrand work that we did for them resulted in a 25% increase in sales over the previous year. So I think it's safe to say that it definitely did not push too far. Pushing it too far. Like I said off the top, rebranding your brewery is no small endeavor. And because it's such a big deal, I believe that it's really important to study other brewery rebrands so that you can learn from them. Not just learn how to succeed, but also how to spot potential pitfalls. So generally, I don't like to talk publicly about other designers' work. It's impossible to know everything that went on behind the scenes of a rebranding project. The creative direction that was supplied by the brewery or by the designers, the origins of all those strategic decisions behind everything. That being said, you can't talk about this subject in BC without talking about the 2017 Vancouver Island logo. And I mean, Vancouver Island's talked about this publicly at this point. They got rid of everything that wasn't working. And when you hear them talk about it now, it kind of feels like the hurting has stopped. Which is partially why I feel comfortable discussing it here. So a bit of context. By 2012, VIB had been in business for 28 years. They were one of the top 5 breweries in the province, I think, and second largest brewery on Vancouver Island, I think. Their look and feel was pretty typical of regional BC breweries at the time. They employed visual cues that spoke to the brand's heritage, and they utilized imagery inspired by the dramatic natural environment of the West Coast. And their packaging was very consistent across their core beers. In 2015, they made a logical update with what I would consider to be a brand refresh. It's kind of on the fence in between a refresh and a rebrand, but they chose to move to a black and white version of their original logo, which made it feel fresher without requiring any other changes. Their packaging update shed some of the heritage look, and it leaned even further into the dramatic coastal imagery. In 2017, the brewery was sold, and the new owner hired an agency to give his acquisition a fresh new look. The end result included a new logo, the VI hexagon, or the 6 logo, as people call it now. They ditched the orca whale completely, which had been a key brand element for them for a long time. The new packaging was very bold and very minimal. They stopped using coastal imagery. Actually, I think they pretty much stopped using any imagery. They kept some of the core beer names, but introduced some other new names that reference local geography. And they pushed a few of their core beers down below 5% ABV, which is not branding, but it's an interesting point as well as part of that move. And it was definitely not in line with BC trends at the time. So as we know, the sleek, new modern look didn't resonate. And I'm fascinated about why that is. I mean, the execution here is pretty well done. The concept is tight. The packaging was impossible to miss in a store. It just wasn't right for them. I mean, I think you could have started a brewery on Vancouver Island if Vancouver Island Brewery didn't exist that year with that packaging, and nobody would have really batted an eye. But their loyal customers from the island, it felt like the brewery had abandoned them a bit. Like the brewery was chasing the urban mainland market and ignoring the people that had bought their beer for the previous 33 years. So exactly 1 year later, the brewery pulled everything back and launched a completely new look. And that's their 4th in 10 years. This time, the branding retained that high contrast blue and white, but reintroduced the orca whale. They also returned to using some illustrations of coastal scenery on their packaging. Overall, it's a bit of a return to what had worked for them in the past, but definitely with a more contemporary style, and it definitely feels more like the island. As far as I can tell, it seems to be working for them. Personally, I like the new logo. The illustrations are not quite the way we would have gone with it, but it definitely feels more authentic to the island, which is, I think, the biggest thing the previous version of the brand was lacking. And they're stretching out in interesting ways, like the update to their pod pack. So the new version, 4 collabs made with small breweries across Vancouver Island. Cartons and the cans employ that striking orca design, and the cartons even got the little pop-up dorsal fin. And they're donating a portion of the profits here to support salmon research. And from what I can tell, it's gone over very well in the market and generated a lot of positive press and goodwill for the brewery. Plus, that dorsal fin plays really well on social media. So my biggest takeaway from thinking about Vancouver Island Brewing and their branding over the years has to do with remembering who your audience is. When planning and executing a rebrand for your brewery, you got to remember, if you're not considering your audience, you run the risk of losing them. And I should say I was not on the inside for this project. This is my take on how it went down from the outside. And if I've got any of these details wrong, please correct me. Yeah? Thanks, Chris. Here's a couple other interesting rebranding examples from this year. Both of them are very similar in some ways to the Vancouver Island 2017 rebrand. They're both pretty drastic changes, and they both move to a very minimal look, very bold. It's going to be interesting to look back in a year or two and consider if either of these breweries pushed it too far. I mean, it's too soon to tell. I have no idea, so we'll see. Besides all those, I can't really think of any other examples of breweries in BC who have pushed the brands too far recently. If you've got any, I'd love to hear about them. Add them to my collection. Seriously, please come tell me about them afterwards. Like I said, we got to study these things so we don't end up doing the same thing over again. Okay, last section. Last topic I want to talk to you about is ways you can use recent innovations in beer packaging to help with your brand evolution. There's an exciting new printing technology that's starting to become available this year, And I think it's going to offer some really interesting possibilities to craft breweries, and that's digital can printing. So these are some samples of digitally printed cans that I saw at CBC in Denver this past April. They're from a company that's installing the first digital can printing press in North America, so they claim. That company is running test prints right now and should be fully operational later this year. And it's in Canada, which is fun. And every designer said, finally. So for transparency, I have no affiliation with the printing company or the company that manufactures the press. I'm just excited about the possibilities that digital can printing is going to bring to the table. And I think other can printing companies are going to follow suit and go this direction eventually as well. So first up, digital printing is going to allow us to print in full color on a can directly. So no more 5 or 6 color printing. The full color effect that we're now used to seeing on stickers and sleeves will soon be available printed directly onto the aluminum substrate. That's exciting because, well, for a few reasons, but one of them is those stickers and sleeved cans, not great for recycling, which is something that I think a lot of breweries rather not talk about right now. This is a test print of one of our clients' cans, Rail Yard Brewing out of Calgary. On the left, you got a professional photo of their current sleeved can. On the right is a crappy cell phone snapshot of a test print can that the printer sent us a couple weeks ago. I haven't seen the actual can in person yet, but the snapshot's pretty encouraging. By the way, I brought a physical sample of a digitally printed full-color can today if anyone wants to have a look at it. So aside from full-color printing, digital is exciting because it offers way lower minimum orders than traditional can printing. It also promises much quicker turnaround times. You know, just like any other sort of digital printing that we're used to outside of beer, you know, it's the actual minimum order quantity would technically be 1 can. If you wanted to run some pilot cans, no problem. You should always run pilot cans, by the way. Another really exciting thing about digital can printing is the opportunities to use variable printing. So this can mean either variable data or variable design. Variable data means that the text on each individual can could be different. Here's an example from a recent Coke campaign where they used variable data to print hundreds of the most popular first names from American teens and millennials and put them on the labels. They tied this into their Share a Coke marketing campaign. You could even go on their website and print a custom one if your name wasn't on that list, like mine wasn't. So you'll soon be able to print unique text on every single can of your beer. Now, what you're going to decide to do with that is up to you. It's going to require some imagination to think of fun or effective ways to use variable data printing. And it'll take a bit of skill to weave it into your brand in a way that makes sense. But it's definitely a new way of thinking that craft breweries are going to be able to start working with, a new creative muscle that they can start exercising. And it's not just text. You'll also be able to use variable design. So the design of every single can could be unique. Here's an example of a run of Absolute bottles. These were not decorated using digital printing, but the idea is still the same. The designer set some base parameters like which colors should be used, and every bottle came out looking completely unique. Here's another example, this time from grocery, Nutella. I mean, if you think craft beer retail shelves look like chaos now, here's an example of a magazine cover that uses variable design. Each cover looks similar, but in fact, they're all unique. They all have that same capital A shape, but the details and the colors that make up that letter are different on every cover. It's pretty fun. It's a little hard to make out what's going on in that picture on the right. It's a whole bunch of magazine covers hanging on a wall display. You can see it a bit better if I zoom in here. Here's another example that's somewhat similar. This is the cover of a promotional brochure for a US design college. Their designer created a modular system that generated over 40,000 unique covers for this one brochure. And you can see the similarities and differences in each design. But I mean, they're different, but they definitely all look related. Like they're all part of the same brand. So the variable design examples that I've shown you have all been very geometric or very abstract. This is because it's relatively easy at this point to tell a digital printing press to constantly rotate between a set of predefined colors for each little section. Geometric and abstract designs are currently quite popular with breweries in that rotation nation business model. I think it's going to be fairly easy to combine variable design into that approach and mix things up even further. And to make things even weirder, there's coming a time in the near future where artificial intelligence is going to get thrown into all of this. It already knows how to paint fairly well. Landscapes, portraits, and weirder stuff. It's working on designing logos. And it's generating stock photography. These are people who are beautiful, diverse, and ready to show up in your next ad campaign. And none of them are real. They've been generated by AI. So once more, for the folks in the back, none of these are real people. They're pretty much indistinguishable from real human beings, but they are just very cleverly arranged pixels, sorted by a machine. So I can't see far enough into the future to know what AI and design is going to mean for designers and breweries eventually, but it's coming, and it might put me out of a job. We'll see. So to wrap up, I'd like to read a quote from Bart Watson. This is in the most recent issue of the New Brewer magazine. To say that the business side of the brewing business is only going to increase in importance going forward is an obvious and broad statement. Nevertheless, it's worth stressing that for many breweries, what's working today is unlikely to work as well even a few years from now. Given the proliferation of options, breweries will need to up their game in order to survive. In an era of intense competition within beverage alcohol, there are too many sophisticated players to not execute the business side as successfully as the brewery. And branding definitely fits into what Bart refers to here as the business side of the whole thing. The amount of time between brewery rebrands is decreasing as the market matures. Very few craft breweries employ a strict set it and forget it model with their brand anymore. Some breweries even use the approach of constant brand evolution, where their brand is always in motion, always changing. Phillips is a great example of that here in this market. And actually, I'd like to encourage you to consider that model because it removes any worries about your brand ever becoming stale. Craft beer market is open and receptive to brands that experiment and change things up. It's also forgiving for breweries that mess up and correct their mistakes. Not all consumer packaged goods industries are like this. So I recommend that you guys celebrate this luxury and indulge in it. And that's it.